Join me in a thought experiment. Do you know how insane asylums and other institutions were created to manage dissidents, re-educate citizens, and even repopulate regions during the Great Industrial Reset of the 1700s and 1800s? The period from 1750 to 1950 was one of the most turbulent in human history, defined by more simultaneous wars and revolutions than almost any other era. The Industrial Revolution acted as a sort of global reset, unfolding amid a seemingly never-ending series of battles. By the mid-1800s, there were so many concurrent major conflicts that it was almost as if a world war was already underway, but divided into smaller, isolated events to avoid being labeled as such. From the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution to the American Revolution and the Civil War, the Taiping Rebellion, the Crimean War, and numerous independence movements and colonial conquests, nearly every corner of the world was involved in some level of disruption during the period leading up to World War I. This constant upheaval shattered the old world order, creating a void that was filled by new regimes using new technologies. These changes displaced and reshaped whole societies, cultures, and global power dynamics in ways that still echo today. The period in question happens to also perfectly coincide with a sudden rise in the institutionalization of larger and larger populations. Wherever there was conflict, we often see the creation of various large-scale institutions with ostensibly humanitarian missions. Yet historical records often reveal them to be full of horrendous human rights violations. Around the world, but especially in the United States, Britain, and their colonial territories, various institutions emerged to contain and manage people classified as undesirable. Prisons, which had long existed, expanded into networks designed to filter populations and identify and isolate the most dangerous individuals, the criminals. The word criminal derives from the Proto-Indo-European root cry, meaning to sieve, discriminate, or distinguish, reflecting the system's goal of sorting out individuals who didn't fit into the norms of the new order. However, the fledgling criminal justice system wasn't just aimed at the wicked, it sought anyone who didn't conform. This led to the birth of a new industry, one that segregated and controlled non-compliant individuals on a massive scale. Initially, most institutions were privately operated, but as madhouses spread, the so-called trade in lunacy emerged as a for-profit model where non-criminals could be detained without due process. By the early 1800s, governments began taking control, leading to the establishment of large-scale facilities capable of housing thousands of individuals in what were referred to as lunatic asylums, insane asylums, or later state hospitals. The criteria for admission were so vague that almost anyone could qualify for confinement. Reasons ranged from political beliefs and religious views to immorality, depression, bad habits, quackery, or even gathering in the head. Many who entered these places never regained their freedom, further blurring the line between asylum and prison. Of course, the displaced populations did not consist only of adults. Between the wars and widespread institutionalization, there was a massive wave of orphaned children, most of whom were sent to orphanages and foundling institutes for re-education. Some evidence even suggests that these children were used to repopulate regions, as seen with the orphan train movement. The official history largely attributes the institutionalization reform movement to only a small handful of individuals. It was so successful that by 1900 in the United States, there were an estimated 100,000 children in orphanages and 75,000 people in prisons, while the number of people in asylums was more than twice as high at an estimated 200,000 patients. They were spread out around some 300 asylums in practically every major city in the country. Many of these facilities were said to be based on the Kirkbride Plan, a sprawling, palatial layout that was built on a grand scale with elaborate designs and expansive grounds, resembling old European castles or royal estates. Curiously, they were often constructed in extremely short time frames, using the highest quality materials and the most skilled craftsmen. Why go to such great lengths for what was a relatively small, marginalized segment of society? Why build these colossal structures with so many unnecessary expenses? Why was there a rush to build so many of them in such a short time? The excessive response by authorities raises red flags when we question the asylum narrative. Could it be that many of these structures already existed and were simply repurposed? Is it possible that many of the so-called lunatics were actually refugees seeking asylum from war-torn homelands? How many of them were not actually crazy, but were there for petty reasons? It's characteristic of the inverters to call them asylums when they clearly functioned more like prisons for cruel and inhumane treatment of countless innocent individuals. In fact, this could be the true origin of the concept of gaslighting. If people talked about the old pre-industrial free energy system, which relied heavily on fluorescent gaslights, they would be put in an asylum where they were manipulated into questioning their own memories and perception of reality. This also explains why they used the old trick of creating an alternate explanation with Hollywood magic, which they did in the 1944 movie Gaslight. Just as quickly as they appeared, the asylums began to disappear. When the process of deinstitutionalization started in the 1950s and 60s, the number of people in mental institutions had swelled to over 500,000. Today, fewer than 37,000 remain in state psychiatric facilities. Most of the grand asylums in the United States have been abandoned or demolished, but the ones that remain are often considered some of the most haunted places on Earth. It's important to note that deinstitutionalization coincided perfectly with the rise of the pharmaceutical industry and psychiatric medication. It's entirely plausible that these institutions may have been used for human experimentation, helping to pave the way for modern pharmacology. Once they opened that door, physical asylums were no longer necessary. In our brave new world, the asylums exist in the mind.